Welcome back to another JS drop from this dot. In this drop, Mark Noonan from Cypress will show you how to spin up a new component test and walk you through a workflow that will allow you to get rapid feedback in the browser as you create and test components using Cypress. Finally, you'll learn how to add a new component to an application and use end-to-end testing to make sure it's working there. Like and subscribe for more JavaScript content. Let's get started.
All right, so hello and welcome. Let's talk a little bit about adding a component through Cypress to your React app. What we see in the middle here is our welcome page for a small React app that has a login screen. And our goal here is to add something called a happy button right around this part of the application. And so that's going to have a couple of responsibilities. The button's going to transform some text it receives. And when we click it, it's going to have this nice kind of confetti side effect. So the plan here is to use Cypress to specify that behavior in our test, build it out in a sort of test-driven development style workflow, make sure it works by clicking through it in the browser. And then when we're happy with the component, we're going to put it into this page here and do a little test from the end-to-end side as well. So to start with this, we're going to look at what we already have. Within this project, I have the happy button set up. It's just right now rendering nothing. So we're going to skip through the process of like, how do we make a React component? How do we pass children? And we're going to go through the stages that you would go through just so it's a little faster and easier to understand. Within Cypress, I'm in component testing mode. You can do component tests or end-to-end tests. They're really similar in how they work. They're both browser-based, user-focused testing. When I click the new spec button, I have this create from component feature that we can use in React applications. And I can see all the things that might be components that I might want to test for. So if I check this happy button component we just looked at, it exports a happy button. So we'll click that. And Cypress has done the work to make a spec file for us. It has the right extension. It has a predictable name. And it's positioned as a sibling to our original component file. So it's exactly where you might want to put this if you're doing component testing. It's a pattern that we really like. It's really short. We just import the component. We import anything we need to, like React, and then we set up the initial describe and it blocks to mount the component within a test, which means you can immediately run this. Now that we're running, we can see that the component is imported and mounted. Obviously, nothing shows up on the screen. If this was your first ever time creating a component, you could go right to the docs from here and learn a little bit more. But initially, this is just an empty component. What I do like, though, is I can click through here and open this in VS Code. This is the file that Cypress created for me. We have more docs links here, and we can start to specify how this component is supposed to work. So initially, let's just say that, okay, it's mounting, but we actually want to mount it with some content and assert that that content comes back out of the component. So this is one command, but we can comment that out. And let's do a slightly different version. Let's close it. Let's pass in some children like the word hello. So you can say, okay, if I did this behavior, if I called the component in this way, I would expect the DOM to be in a certain condition as well. So I would say sci.contains hello. And this is really basic. There's no even visibility assertions here. We're just like, did it get there? And we can see that it failed. The only thing about this that I would change right now is it's failing after 4 seconds, because in the component spec, well, in an end-to-end spec, that wait is actually pretty useful. Cypress will retry and retry. But in a component spec, there's not really as much risk of things taking a long time to actually appear on the screen. There's no network requests. There's no API calls that are going to be slow. So we can customize this timeout for component tests, and we can make it a little shorter. And we can just do that in the config right here for this particular test. I think that'll be fine. You can also set this up globally. I'm just going to say 500 milliseconds. Give me half a second so that when I'm working, it's really fast if something's wrong, because I'm just making a single component. So now we'll come back to our component file, and we'll give it the ability to render out that text. Like the first probable thing we could do is we could actually just say, okay, well, this is passing because it did that. Right? We just put the text literally in there. But of course, that's not really important. What matters and what's going to matter later is that it passes back out what it was passed in. So we'll put the children in here. We'll see that this is still passing. And because it's really fast, if you need to rerun it, like you can see this is 18 milliseconds. So you can hit the rerun button to double check that everything is good. But it's rerunning based on watching your files change. So now we have this idea of, well, it's supposed to be a button. So I'm going to upgrade my test here by asserting that it actually will spit out a button element. We get all the accessibility benefits of a button element. I'm also going to say that that should be visible. So nothing else in the component should be covering this up. One reason that we can do this very effectively in Cypress is you're going through a real browser with a real CSS rendering engine. So you're going to actually know if something is like positioned in a way that blocks this from being visible. Right now it's failing because we're looking for a button, but we don't have a button. So in our component, we can just make this a button element. When we do that, we have a passing test, but we sort of have a style problem, right? We have an unstyled button. We look here, the buttons in this application all look like this. So the way to change that is to use the actual button component that's imported up here. So our happy button is like a variation wrapped around our core button component. I think that's pretty common. And now in Cypress, we can see we get the styles from the core button component. So the last thing to do to make it happy is add the expectation that it will transform the text in some way. Back here in my test, I'm going to say this should have the smiley face before the text I passed in. So now our string that we give as a prop or as a child is one value, and the expectation in the assertion is the component has transformed this input, made a specific output that we can use. So let's save this. And we'll see that the test is yelling at us because the component doesn't behave that way yet. That's okay. We can grab this, put this into the component, and we're happy. We've satisfied the principle of the component to be a happy button. The next thing to think about is what's the side effect? We talked about like explosions, emojis, confetti, like these are the kind of things that we want to do. And so we can also kind of test drive that. I know that I'm using the emoji explosion library, and I know that I'm specifying only do stars. Just because I've used this library before and I like it, I can come around to my test and say, okay, I want to only do stars. I'm actually going to grab this here and just use this as a reference to say we can use testing library in here. So if you happen to be coming from another context and you're not familiar with Cydoc contains yet, you can use testing library in Cypress as well, if that's more familiar to you. Or in some cases, like in this one, it's a more effective way to get the exact information we want, which is all of the things that contain this. I'm just going to specify these are here. I'll do my favorite assertion too. Should be visible. And let's see what the test is doing. It's failing because we don't have the implementation of this yet. So as you can see, we're doing a really, really fast, tiny feedback loops that are more for the example purposes, but this applies even to more complicated components. If we come in here, I'm just going to skip right to the implementation here. So I'm going to get rid of this line here, and we'll actually start to output the behavior that has the side effects we want. So we'll come through. Let's reload here, and we're still not passing. And the reason that we're not passing is that the test doesn't do anything to create the side effect. So if I was debugging this, I might come around and I might be like, I'm clicking, right? I have the browser to see that I'm clicking. So it does work. Why is my test still failing? And when I come through, I can see we have a visibility check here, but we have no click. So I'm going to change this. I'm taking away the is visible because Cypress will check if it's visible before you click it. So you get that for free when you do an interaction like a click. And now we have a passing test. And we even have this like snapshot where these initially came in. So I can see there's some stars in there. At this moment in time, that's where the library put them into the DOM, and Cypress detected that they were there after the click happened. So we're passing the test. So this is enough for me to be happy that this component is working correctly. It's doing the two things we discussed. It's got this button with certain transformations of the text, and we can do an interaction and we can assert that we got the expected results after that. It is possible to be more specific. So if I wanted to have other things that I cared about, I could say, okay, yeah, the output of this, let's actually change some stuff together and we'll say these things should be visible. I really like the number 10. I've been watching a lot of Monk lately where the number 10 comes up a lot as a nice number. And so that's what we're going to do. And we're specifying this. This happens to be how we've configured our component already, so we're passing. Now we'll move on to watch how this works in an end-to-end test. So I'm going to switch Cypress into end-to-end mode. And the reason to switch is that you have totally different config. Like that time that we just looked at, there's all kinds of things you might want to have different in an end-to-end test. So this is a test all it does is visit that page that we looked at in this application here, and we don't have any assertions on this yet. So we'll come through, I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to say I want this button to say something different than the spec file we just looked at for the component. So as we talked about, the component does not own the text content. The component just owns transforming it and adding the effect where you click on it and you make stars. So in this case, we're going to say I want this to make stars, and it's failing. You can see it's back to this 4,000 milliseconds because we're out of that component spec now. And let's say this button was waiting on some network thing to happen. It's okay to have a little retry window. So I'm going to leave that alone in this spec, and I'm going to go to the component that would render this stuff out, which is the login form. And again, skipping forward a little bit, we're going to make the button behave correctly. But first, maybe I'll make it fail by putting in the wrong text or something like that. Like now we can see the buttons here. That re-rendered, this re-rendered. So we're happy the button is existing in our application now, and I just didn't have the right text yet. So that's okay. We will make it pass. Let's reload the application here. Great, make stars. And so now we've gotten an end-to-end test that specifies the one unique thing about this that is not controlled by the component. So I'm not going to test the stars again because the stars behavior is actually belonging to this component here where it's specified. So there's no way through a prop or any other thing that like some other component in a higher part of the hierarchy is likely to come in and mess with this. I'm comfortable just testing this with the component test. But from the end-to-end test, I want to make sure that we have it. And I may choose to assert what happens after we click as well, just kind of as a practice in case there's other things on the page that could cause this to be disabled or something like that. So we have like a decision to make about the value of duplicating tests across different testing types. But the important thing is this code is like the same, right? When we look at the login page, cite a contains button, this is exactly the same type of code. We can use testing library in the same way if we want to. So when we're switching from the vertical component tests that looks right into what's the HTML doing, what's all the specifics, what's the component responsible for. When we switch to like something more horizontal and high level, like an end-to-end test that's cutting through many components, we can keep like the syntax we're using the same. We have our same assumptions about the availability of dev tools. So because we're in a browser, we can inspect here. And we can do this in component or end-to-end testing and see exactly what's happening in the part of the DOM that we're looking at. So hope all this is really useful. I hope it's a good introduction to Cypress component testing. If you have other follow-up questions or you have more interest in this, I'm going to share a lot of links around resources. There are some really deep React resources that you can check out. Yeah, let's feel free to check that out. Thanks. Bye.